Well, thank you very much, Paul, and good morning, everyone. Well, if not only for me, education is perhaps the most consequential topic we cover at WPC. As many parents know, the need for choice in education has become even more clear, especially during these last 2 years. While many states have given families more choice options, Washington State has not. Our first session today is titled The Power of Parents to Direct the Education of Their Children. Finne, our education director at WPC, will lead this session. As a reminder, if you have questions and comments, please place them in the questions tab and we will get to them at the end of this session. Good
morning.
Thank
you very much, Maia. I hope you can all hear me. It's great to be here this morning talking about this important topic, especially on the eve of worries that the schools may close again out of COVID overreaction. I have a fantastic guest today, DeAngelis, to help me discuss school choice across the nation and here in Washington State. Corey is the National Director of Research for the American Federation for Children. He was named on the Forbes 30 Under 30 list for his work on education policy and received the Buckley Award from America's Future in 2020. His research has been published in peer-reviewed academic journals, and he often appears in outlets like the Wall Street Journal and USA Today. He and Neil McCluskey co-edited a book called School Choice Myths, Setting the Record Straight on Education Freedom. Corey is so busy and so all over the place on this topic that he, I think, has been on national TV 3 times in the past week. So I am very happy to have him with us today. I'm going to just mention a couple of bills that are being considered before the legislature starting in a week. There are 2 school choice bills that will be introduced. One, House Bill 1633 by Representative James Walsh, and a second one that was introduced last year and made no progress, House Bill 1215 by Representative Vicky Kraft. Both are good school choice bills, and we're going to discuss those later in the program. But first, I'm going to ask Corey to talk to us a little bit about what the school choice landscape is, what has happened over the past year, what you're seeing now, today, how different states are responding to what we see is renewed threats to close the schools to learning. So thank you, Corey. Please take it away.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Lieve, and it's good to talk to you again. And everybody in the audience, thanks for coming out to this discussion. Look, school choice is a hot topic right now, and the way that I would put it is that COVID didn't break the government school system. In a lot of ways, it was already broken. And the past year and a half, 2 years now, essentially we're going on 2 years of school closures in some places. It's really shined a spotlight on the main problem with K-12 education all across America, which happens to be a massive, long existing power imbalance between the government school monopoly and individual families. The private schools from the get-go were able to figure out how to reopen their doors for business. They magically were able to do it. Daycares were able to do it. Private businesses were fighting to reopen from the get-go. There's even an example I like to bring up from California. In Sacramento County, there was this weird health closure order for schools, but not for daycares. And a private Catholic school in Sacramento County actually rebranded itself as a daycare by retraining all of its employees so that they could open up and have the right to meet the needs of their customers, the families and their kids. And I think the main difference here with all these other industries and sectors when it comes to education is that one of those sectors gets your children's education dollars regardless of whether they open their doors for business. And who would have thought in 2 years into this, you have the Chicago Teachers Union just late last night voted at midnight Eastern. They released the information that they're not going back to work today. And so they're closing for at least 2 weeks in Chicago after they've already received over $1 billion in Chicago, and nationwide, there's been about $190 billion in COVID relief bailout money from the federal government since March of 2020. The schools are swimming in cash. They don't know what to do with it. If you look at the Daily Wire yesterday, you'll see a report by Luke Rosiak actually pointing out that a lot of the COVID money went towards diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. The Associated Press has reported that a lot of that COVID money went to just building more sports stadiums. This was never about safety. And the sooner that we realize that, the faster that we can get out of this mess. And I think there is only one way to get out of this this strange loop that we're in. And it is to fund the student directly as opposed to these closed buildings. And thankfully, over the past year and a half, 2 years now, families are finally figuring out that there isn't any good reason to fund closed, failing government institutions when you can fund the student directly instead. We're already calling 2021 the year of school choice because of so much success that we've seen in state houses across the country. 19 states in 2021 expanded or enacted programs to fund students as opposed to systems. And national polling by Real Clear Opinion Research has found a 10 percentage point surge in support for educational freedom, or what most people call school choice, with now 74% of families, Americans across the United States, supporting school choice initiatives. And I think it's because the teachers unions have really overplayed their hand and showed their true colors. And at this point, they're actively destroying their own empire in places like Chicago. And if they're gearing up to do the same thing in Washington, who knows what's going to happen? There might already be some disruptions. But look, schools should be the last things to close and the first things to open. They're some of the safest places in society. Their customers are essentially one of the lowest risk groups, children. And the science has consistently shown that these school closures have hurt kids academically, mentally, socially, even physically. Kids have increased, the percentage of kids with obesity problems has increased over the past year, and teen suicide rates, or at least emergency department visits associated with teen suicide attempts, have jumped by 31% nationwide, with even higher percentage jumps for female students. And I believe that's about a 51% jump. And for what benefit? Again, there is no benefit to closing the schools, except for the teachers unions have figured out that they can hold children's education hostage in perpetuity in order to use that as leverage for even more money from the taxpayer. The way that I put it before is that underperforming or closed private schools, well, they'll have to shut down because families can take their money elsewhere. Underperforming or closed government schools, they get more money. We saw that play out in 2021. They're trying it again. And it's just this weird, perverse set of incentives. It's completely backward in the government-run school system, where they profit from doing a bad job because they can always go back to the taxpayer or to the state houses and say, well, we're failing because we need more money. We've seen this even before COVID. This has always been a problem where we've increased per pupil education expenditures nationwide by about 287% after adjusting for inflation since 1960. Decade after decade, year after year, we pour more and more resources into the system, and it doesn't get any better because it's a monopoly. They don't have any particularly strong incentives to care about kids, and it's becoming more and more obvious this year. This is the silver lining of the pandemic, that parents are fighting back. They've had enough. And all of society is starting to realize that, look, if your Walmart is closed, it's inconvenient, but at least families could take their money elsewhere. If your school is closed, families should similarly be able to take their children's education dollars elsewhere. In fact, families should be able to take their children's education dollars to the education provider of their choosing, regardless of the school's reopening decision, because education funding is supposed to be meant for educating children, not for propping up and protecting a particular institution. We should fund students, not systems. And by the way, look, we already do this with so many other taxpayer-funded initiatives. Think about higher education. We have Pell Grants for low-income students. You have GI Bills for veterans. We don't tell the students that they must spend their Pell Grant funding at a residentially assigned government-run provider of higher education. We have pre-K programs. Think about the federal Head Start program. The money doesn't go to a residentially assigned government-run provider of pre-K services. Instead, the money goes to the family, and they can choose a public or private, religious or non-religious provider of pre-K services. We do the same thing with food stamp programs. For example, we don't tell low-income families that they must spend their food stamp dollars at a residentially assigned government-run grocery store. And whether you are for or against food stamp funding levels, we can all agree that if we're going to spend the money, it should go to people as opposed to a residentially assigned government-run building. With food stamps, the money goes to the family, and they can rightfully choose Walmart if they want, but they can also choose Safeway or Trader Joe's. The money follows the decision of the family. And all we're arguing here with the concept of school choice is that we should apply the same logic to those in-between years of K-12 education and fund people, not buildings. And what's interesting to me is that a lot of the same people who support funding individuals as opposed to institutions with everything else when it comes to food stamps or Medicaid dollars, higher education with Pell Grants or the pre-K programs, they only oppose funding people when it comes to those in-between years of K-12 education. And why would that be? The only difference is one of power dynamics. Choice is the norm with higher education, pre-K, and everything else in the United States for now, thankfully. But choice threatens an entrenched special interest only when it comes to those in-between years of K-12. And so they fight as hard as possible, the teachers unions and the superintendent unions and other government employee unions, and they fight as hard as possible against any change to the status quo because they want to get your money regardless of whether they even open their doors. And that's becoming more and more obvious. We've seen so much of a surge in support of school choice across the nation. And in Washington, we now have this bill that was introduced that Liev talked about a second ago, that I think about $10,000 of your kids' education dollars would follow them to a private or homeschool situation, any approved education provider of their choosing. And that's the purest form of school choice. It is the gold standard of funding students as opposed to systems. This is the only way out of this mess. It's the only way that schools will finally have an incentive to care about the needs of kids as opposed to the other way around. In the current system, they don't have that incentive there. And this would provide true bottom-up accountability so that the system would exist to meet the needs of families.
Yes, Corey, that's awesome. Let me tell you what's happening here in Washington State, and so that everyone else can hear. We've had 55,000 families have pulled their kids out of Washington State schools this last fall. That's over 5% of the total. That shows that's more students than the largest school district, than the Seattle Public Schools, which is the largest school district in the state. This is a sizable number of students. This means then that these districts are not going to be getting funding because the funding from the state is based on per student funding. And they are all up in arms about the fact that they're not going to be getting that funding. So there will be bills introduced in this legislative session. I know this because they did it last session. There were 40,000 students that dropped out last year. Last session, the budget provided backfill funding for these lost students to the public school system. Now more students have left. Now they want more money. And that approximates about $1 billion, $800 million or so. That's what they want. And that's why I think it's pretty ironic that Representative Walsh's bill would provide $10,000 to 100,000 families. The first come, first serve. That's about 10% of the student population, only about 7% of the funding. And if we just took that money and gave the money to the families who have decided that the schools are not serving them well, gave this money to them so they could send their children to private schools, then the purpose of public education would be fulfilled, because then we would be publicly funding private individual choices to send their children to the school that best meets their needs, that is open during COVID, for example, that is not delivering a terrible achievement gap that we have in our state. We have one of the largest achievement gaps between Black and Hispanic children and white and Asian children. And it's getting worse, of course, during COVID. And while our legislature often claims that they care so much about this achievement gap, they refuse to give those families an option out of the public school, the failing public school in their urban district. So that's what we're seeing. We're seeing other problems, but it seems to me this idea is graspable by every family. Give me the resources so I can make the decision. And let's just talk about this a little bit more. What does this do,
Yeah.
family?
So let's continue on that thought for a second. Look, in Washington State, according to the 2019 U.S. Census Bureau data, Table 11 from the annual survey of school system finances, you can Google, it's pretty easy. Washington State spends over $17,000 per kid per year statewide. Some districts are probably higher, some lower, but on average, over $17,000 per kid per year. A lot more now after the federal bailout money. I think that amounts to at least $3,000 per kid. It's probably over $20,000 per kid now in Washington State after all of the influx of supposed COVID relief that didn't really have anything to do with COVID and reopening the schools. The private school tuition on average in 2021, according to Private School Review in the state's only about $11,000 or $12,000.
Right.
And so if you have the funding follow the child, even if you give them half of that 20,000, you give them the 10,000 that is proposed in the bill. Well, the public schools get to keep a lot of the money for the students who are no longer there. So it's a win-win situation. The families get another choice if they voluntarily choose to take the 10,000 to another provider, and then the public schools get to keep thousands of dollars for students that are no longer there. So their first argument against this bill is they're going to say, well, this is stealing money from the public schools. My first response is the money doesn't belong to the government schools in the first place. The money is meant for educating the child, and they can take the funding to the public schools that they want. With this program, your option to go to the public school is not taken off the table. Every family should be able to choose public or private. And they're essentially telling on themselves with this argument too, that they understand that thousands of families aren't happy with what they're getting in the current system. That's an argument for choice, not an argument against it, especially when you consider that advantaged families are already at least more likely to have school choice. The most advantaged in society can live near the best quote unquote public schools. We shouldn't really call them public schools because families have actually gone to jail for lying about their addresses to get into these better quote unquote public schools. And two, more advantaged families are at least more likely to be able to pay out of pocket for private school tuition and fees. So funding the student directly allows for more families to access these kinds of educational opportunities. So in that sense, school choice is an equalizer at the same time. And fighting against these types of initiatives disproportionately impact the least advantaged in society that don't have any other choice without the additional funding to be able to pay for private school tuition fees. So they're the ones that get stuck disproportionately in the worst schools. That is an injustice that exists in the current system that can be remedied by allowing the funding to follow the child. It's such an easy solution that wins on all fronts. And it also leads to better public schools at the same time. The district schools up their game in response to competition. Once they have to start to think about the needs of families, well, one, they start to allocate their resources more efficiently, more towards the classroom. Teacher salaries have actually been found to go up in the public schools in response to school choice competition. I wrote about this at the Washington Examiner at a post called School Choice Benefits Teachers Too. If you want to look at the peer-reviewed literature on this subject, you don't have to just take my word for it. And 25 of 27 studies have additionally found that private school choice competition leads to better outcomes in the public schools. It's a win-win situation. School choice is a rising tide that lifts all boats. But at the end of the day, the best argument for educational freedom is that the money doesn't belong to the government schools in the first place. School choice doesn't defund public schools or steal money from public schools. If anything, public schools defund families. And school choice initiatives just return the money to the hands of the rightful owners, or at least the intended beneficiaries of that funding.
I think that's an excellent way to put it. I think that school choice drives excellence. What I'm very concerned about now is, together with the COVID school shutdown, we've had the advent of ideologies, critical race theory ideologies, radical curricula of different kinds that are distracting children and lowering and degrading the academic learning standards that the children are now getting in the schools. Of all things, on the eve of COVID, hopefully COVID will be over soon. We're now shifting a focus to learning unproven ideologies that are going to degrade what the children are going to be learning. And I think that the only way to fight that is to pull your kids out of a system that doesn't listen. We've had school board elections across the state where people are running to because their communities are up in arms, upset with what is being taught to their children, and they can't do anything about it. So now we have a lot of school board directors in our state are doing what they can to fix this, but their hands really are tied in many ways by the top-down central control model that we have essentially in our state, where you have to submit curriculum choices for approval by the state superintendent of public instruction. So this is a difficult thing to fix from the school board perspective. But think of the corrective if a family can say, I've had it, I'm not going to participate, this system can't be fixed. I'm going to find a school that is responsive to my values, that is driving excellence and achievement, that pushes children to achieve to the best standard that they can. Corey, yesterday I saw Bellevue School District, which is supposed to be one of the best school districts in our area, is now talking about eliminating grades because it is not accepted. It hurts people's feelings to have too many failing grades. So this is what we're seeing coming down the pipe. The families are aware of this, and they're saying, "What can I do?" And they can't do much about it at all.
I mean, in neighboring Oregon, I think the governor just signed into law like a month or two ago that they're not requiring kids to be able to read, write, or do basic math skills in order to graduate from high school. I mean, and it's all in the name of supposed equity. This is a problem, right? There are two ways to achieve this equity that everybody is striving for. One is you could lower the standards for everybody, and then everybody is worse off afterwards, but everybody's equally worse off, even though that doesn't actually achieve equity because some people will still sort with the low standards and overachieve those standards. But the other way, and the more obvious way to achieve equity, is to allow more equality of opportunity. By allowing more families to have educational opportunities, you allow for more families to access schools that best align with their values and allow their kids to learn in the best way possible and to be the right fit for their kids. And also, you could also raise the standards in the schools and try to do a better job instead of saying, oh, well, you know, it's not our fault and we're just gonna, just throw our hands up and say there's nothing we can do about it. Why not work harder at trying to achieve equity by raising standards?
Let's talk about how equity cannot be achieved when you have a forced assignment to school, the local school district. I think this is something we haven't talked about enough, how it is a legacy of our racist past that we had redlining of our neighborhoods, and that children then were assigned based on their zip codes to the school in their neighborhood, which has a disproportionate burden on the inner city families that don't have access to a high quality school. So how is equity achieved if you are forcing children to go to a failing public school? Here in Washington State, I've counted up the number of schools that have been identified as by the state as failing according to their own metrics. 118 failing schools, 44,000 children repeatedly assigned by school officials to these failing schools. Yet they're not given access to public charter schools. They're not given private school choice dollars to go to a private school. How is that equitable?
It isn't. And there's vast inequities that are entrenched in the government-run school system. That there ever was a prime example of systemic racism, you can point to the government school system because of this redlining of the country's past and because of, these district lines that segregate kids into failing schools. That's absolutely horrendous. And for people to support those types of policies and to fight against allowing families from all different backgrounds to access better alternatives, that's a problem. And we should call it out over and over again. And look, I think the only way out of this is not a top-down solution. I think it's great that some parents are pushing back at school board meetings. I think you should get your voice heard at the school board meetings. But at the end of the day, you're still just trying to mold a one-size-fits-all system that's just not going to work for everybody, even if you're in the well, let's say you're not in the majority from one year to the next, or let's say the person that you like gets into office at the school board and then they try to change things and then it takes a decade to change. Why should families have to wait any longer? Low-income families shouldn't have their kids trapped in schools another day. And the best way to allow them to have more opportunities is to, one, push for change within the system. That's great. But at the same time, understand that the more immediate solution is to attach the funding to the child. And the better form of accountability is bottom-up accountability. I think this is the only true form. It is at least the strongest form of accountability that exists. Allowing families to vote with their feet provides that bottom-up competitive pressure for public schools to do the right thing at the same time. And another problem that we've seen over the past year and a half with remote learning, we shouldn't even call it remote learning because the kids weren't really learning all that much of anything. We should call it remote instruction, or just call it for what it is. It's a school closure all across the country. And that's the problem here, that families also saw what was going on in the classroom. And one of the best arguments historically for school choice has been that they're not doing a good job on math reading and science in the public schools. But there's been this whole new can of worms that has emerged that is arguably a stronger argument for families having choices in education, is that they don't want to feel like they're sending their kids to a school where they're being indoctrinated for 13 years. And so because there are these curriculum misalignments with the values of families, that's started another push for educational freedom, that families shouldn't be forced to send their kids and to pay for 13 years of brainwashing by the government in a particular school. They should be able to take their kids' education dollars to a school that best aligns with their values. And that could be the public school. And I don't take a side on what the curriculum should look like. I just understand that families are going to disagree about what the curriculum should look like, because we are not a one-size-fits-all society, and kids and families have diverse needs, and that's okay. We have to be okay with people disagreeing with us, but at the same time, we shouldn't force kids into a system where they're all having to learn something that their families vehemently disagree with. Because again, at the end of the day, the most advantaged are the ones that are able to exit that system and to instill their values with their children's education. It's the least advantaged that are stuck no matter what, sending their kid to an indoctrination factory for 13 years. That's a problem. No family should be in that situation.
I agree. Corey, tell our listeners what the governor of Arizona just did in face of the possible threat of closed schools.
Yeah, so that's the best. This news just broke yesterday, right before my hit with Harris Faulkner on Fox News yesterday. I think she saw my Twitter right before we went live, and I didn't know that she was going to ask me about this, but it broke right before we went on. The Governor Ducey of Arizona just announced a program that if your public school is closed in Arizona, even for one day, you can take $7,000 of your kids' taxpayer-funded education dollars to a private school or a micro school, any approved education provider. It could even be a private tutor that you can pay for these like pandemic pod type of situations. And that's a good idea. I think the money should follow the child regardless of what the public school does, because people have so many different reasons as to why they want to choose. It might be the curriculum, might be because the remote instruction isn't very good. It might be because the bullying is a problem, and maybe there's disciplinary issues in the schools. And there's so many reasons why people might not want to send their kid to the residentially assigned option. And so this is a step in the right direction. Any form, and it is only for low-income families in Arizona for this particular program. And the way that the governor was able to do it and not have to go through the legislature was he used American Rescue Plan funding. So remember, I talked about earlier that we've already allocated $190 billion to the states. Most of the money hasn't been spent yet in most states. They have more money than they know what to do with. I've heard stories, in Texas where they're just buying technology and putting it into empty classrooms that they're not using because they just need to figure out ways to spend the money. They're putting the money towards stadiums. They're putting the money towards these diversity, equity, inclusion programs. They're hiring more people. In Los Angeles public schools, their enrollment dropped by 6%, but they're planning on increasing per pupil education funding by about 69%. They're increasing the number of teachers by about 8%, the number of custodial workers by about 25%, and the number of psychological social workers in the schools by about 80%. In what other industry do you lose 6% of your customers and then you get more money and put more people and adults into the building? The sad reality that is becoming more and more obvious with public education in America is that the system has become a jobs program for adults more so than it is an education program for students. And that's absolutely horrendous, but at least more and more people are figuring it out. Hopefully the jig is up. And I also saw in the Q&A, I wanted to answer a question real quick. Someone asked about, Washington's a blue state, but Democrats are less likely to vote for school choice. I hear you on that, but I believe, and there's one reason, and it's not because that Democrats on the ground don't support school choice. If you poll Democrats, they support it as well as Republicans and independents. It's the problem is that the teachers unions overwhelmingly campaign contributions go to Democrats. The American Federation of Teachers, for example, where Randy Weingarten is the president, 99% or more of the campaign contributions from the AFT went to Democrats every single election cycle over the past 30 years. And so the Democrats are in a tough situation, right? Not because they're bad people. It's just they rely on these campaign contributions from the teachers unions. But I think that's going to change soon, particularly with this COVID moment, in that for a long time in K-12 education, the only special interest group was the teachers union. But now there's a new special interest group in town, parents who want more of a say in their kids' education. So now the politicians have to think about and consider about what the parents actually want, because they're forming groups together in states all across the country. And if parents push back, they become this new special interest group that politicians have to reckon with. And we saw that play out in Virginia, a state that went 10 percentage points to Biden just last year, swung 12 percentage points the other way to Glenn Youngkin. And it was all about education and how he wanted to promote parental rights and school choice at the same time. So it's becoming less and less politically profitable for politicians to come out against parents. So I think we're going to see a seismic shift going forward. And the more that Republicans lean into educational freedom, the more it makes the Democratic politicians think, well, maybe I should do the same thing. And I think in the future, hopefully sooner than later, we'll see school choice becoming more of a bipartisan thing in the state houses as well, because of this impact of this new special interest, this new sleeping giant that has been awakened by the teachers unions, the parents.
Well, there's no question that that's true. I mean, if you look at I follow groups on Facebook that are local parent groups, and I have never seen such a growth of parent groups arguing for more control over what their children learn. They have various interests and various directions that they're going, but they're all hearing about school choice now and having control over the dollars, which is very encouraging. I think that's definitely happening here. Parents are no longer going to sit back and take this lying down. I'm hearing about initiatives being put on the ballot for school choice if we can't get it through the legislature. This isn't going away, and our legislators are learning. Of course, a lot of them are just new and they have not thought about these topics before, and they see that it's the union that's closing the schools. There's no longer that whole deception has been now clarified. It's the union that controls whether the schools are open. It's not the state superintendent. It's not the governor. It's not the local school district or the school board directors. It's not the local superintendent. It's the union. And we've seen this over and over again over COVID. The local district would say, superintendent says, we're going to open school on Monday. And then the union says, oh, no, you're not. So it's very clear who controls the levers of power in our state. And that is a new development in our state. We didn't, clearly know that until COVID.
Yeah, and look, the union doesn't even really do all that much for teachers either. If you look at the long-term trends, if you look between 1992 and 2014, per pupil education expenditures in the US jumped by 27% after adjusting for inflation. But teacher salaries in real terms actually dropped by 2%. And the reason for that is every time they get more money, they put it towards putting more people into the buildings, which is great for the union bosses like Randy Weingarten, who make over $560,000 a year. But it's not so great for kids or teachers for that matter, because the money doesn't go towards raising teacher salaries for the people who are already in the system. They just want more dues paying members. And the way you do that, and we're seeing that, like what I said with Los Angeles, they're losing students, but just putting more people into the building. You're seeing that with pushes by the unions at the national level as well to call for more staff. When they call for reduced class sizes, that's essentially what they're calling for as well, because reduced class size means you need more people in the buildings. And look, this doesn't have a lot to do with the individual teachers or the kids. So, and at the same time, I don't think this is because the people are particularly evil, or that they have bad intentions. They're doing what they do. They're fighting to strengthen their union. But the kids don't have a union. And the closest things we have are their parents that are banding together. And I'm optimistic going forward, honestly, because look, parents care about their kids more than anybody else. And parents they've woken up the past year and a half, and they're not going to sit down and shut up anymore, no matter how many times members of the National School Board Association or the establishment try to label them as domestic terrorists. This is only emboldening parents to push back harder than ever. And they're going to fight harder to educate their kids as they see fit, harder than anyone will ever fight to take that right away from them. So I'm on the side of parents going forward, and it would be wise of politicians to listen to these parents as well, because they have a vested interest in their kids' education, and they know that now. They're never going to forget how powerless they felt in 2020, 2021. We're working on 2022 as well with these school closures again. And parents are never going to forget this, and they're going to make sure that they fight to make sure that they never feel powerless like they did ever again going forward. And the best way to do that is to have the money follow the child, so that you can empower parents to do the right thing and to seek out the best options for their own kids.
That's great. So well said. The child is not the mere creature of the state, right?
That's right.
The parents have a fundamental right to direct the education of their children. Now that I think we'll go over to questions. We've got a lot of interesting questions for us. Thanks. I hand it over to Maia.
Thank you, Liv, and thank you so much, Corey. We do have time for a few questions. So I'll just kick it off here. I read in our Q&A tab from one of our participants some concerns about kids whose families don't take advantage of education options, and the concern that they might be left behind. I know I've read recent studies that show that providing school options for students provide improved outcomes for all students, and in some cases, if not many cases, especially for students that are remaining in those public schools. So Chris, can you give us an example of a state that's providing education options well? And then Liv, if you could contrast that with what our state, Washington State, has been doing or allowing.
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that 27 studies exist on this topic. 25 of the 27 find statistically significant positive effects of private school competition on the kids who remain in the public schools. So school choice is a rising tide that lifts all boats. You can find that at the EdChoice 123's website, EdChoice 123's. If you Google that, you'll find it. But there's also a peer-reviewed meta-analysis on this topic by a University of Texas at Austin professor, Jabbar, Jabbar, in 2019. It's in a journal called Educational Policy. So if you were to just type in Jabbar 2019 meta-analysis competition, you'll find that their meta-analytic average, pooling all the studies together, also finds statistically significant positive effects on the kids who remain in the public school. So this is one of the clearest strands of literature in the school choice debate. But also, if you want to look at a particular state, look at Florida. Florida, over the past few decades, has massively increased their access to educational freedom. And at the same time, their nation's report card scores have skyrocketed from the middle of the pack to towards the top 5, depending on the outcome you're looking at, after adjusting for differences in demographics across states and over time. So that's a success story where they've increased liberty in education and at the same time increased improvements in the public schools as well. So they've increased equity, they've increased liberty, personal freedom. And again, this is a win-win solution. It's not just an exit valve, because it has this side effect of helping the public schools too. And by the way, even if we didn't see this play out in the data, I would still say that the family should have the right to exit, regardless of what how good the government school's response is, because families that are advantaged are already able to exit. Let's allow more families to exit, at least give them the opportunity so they'll have more of a likelihood to be able to access that option. And yeah, Leave if you wanted to add on to that. But
well, I think that just developing that a little bit more, think of the families who buy a house in the suburbs, and what is the first question that they ask? They buy themselves a house in a district with the best schools. They pay expensive, they buy expensive houses so they can send their kids to a good public school. So those people have school choice because they have the resources to buy a house in a district with a good school. Now those families have to consider the fact that other families don't have those resources and don't have that choice to send their kid to a good public school. So I get upset by the hypocrisy of people being happy with their local public school and then working to block other families from having a similar choice. And so that seems to me a basic principle. You've done a great job in calling out the hypocrisy of many, people running for office, saying that they're with a union. They're not going to give anyone school choice, but they sent all their children and grandchildren to private schools. That to me is the ultimate hypocrisy, and something that should be corrected. In Washington State, we are a blue state, but we do have public charter schools. They're doing very well. They're successful schools. They're educating 4,000 families. Those families now have choice to exit their failing public school. Most of the families there are low-income minority families. They are happy with their public charter school. That's one choice we have. We don't have magnet schools. Corey, tell them about your experience with your magnet school. Just tell them your personal story.
Yeah, so I actually attended government-run schools all through K through 12. So if I made any mistakes today, it's probably part of the reason. I didn't really get a great education.
You made none at all.
but no, in high school, I did have the opportunity to go to something called a magnet school, which is still run by the government. Technically, it's a district-run school, but you're not residentially assigned to magnet schools, and they can have selective admissions. And I felt that had a positive impact on my life trajectory. Because the residentially assigned school that I was supposed to go to was not a very high quality school. So I think this had a positive impact on my life. And I think other families should have access to these kinds of options. But at the end of the day, it shouldn't be limited to a type of school that's run by the government. A magnet school is an improvement in that they don't have a geographic monopoly and they have to attract customers much like charter schools. And so they're a little better than the status quo, but at the same time, I should be able to take my child's education dollars to the magnet if I want, to the government-run school, residentially assigned school if I want, to a charter school if I want, but I should also be able to take that money to a private school or some type of homeschool setup like a micro school or a pandemic pod. The money should follow the child to wherever they're getting an education.
Yes, I mean, absolutely, because then you are not subject to losing that choice. Which here in Washington State, we've eliminated the magnet schools. We've eliminated the selective admission schools in Seattle public schools because it's not equitable. So when you're in a government system, you're always stand to lose your right of choice. And public charter schools here are under attack. So you are not really free when you're in a government school, like you would be if you control the money.
And we're seeing that this year, even with the year of school choice. You have some backtracking in places like Rhode Island. They had charter schools in the state, but they just voted this year, in 2021 at least, to put a 3-year moratorium on expanding charter schools in a place where families are seeking out charter schools more than ever. Nationwide, there's been a study that came out a few months ago that found that government schools lost about 1.3 or 3.3% of their school-age population. It's more than that in Washington State. About 1.5 million students, there's been a mass exodus from the public school system. But for charter schools, across 42 different states where they had data, the enrollment jumped by 7%. So in a time where families need options most, you have the monopoly going out to protect itself more than ever. And this happened in places like Oregon, nearby. It was one of the worst scenarios where
Yes.
Right when the schools closed in March of 2020, the Oregon Teachers Union lobbied to the government to make it illegal to switch to a virtual charter school, which is still a public school. But the families knew that, well, the government schools haven't done this virtual thing. They're going to do a bad job. I'm going to switch to these virtual schools that have been doing it for decades. And the dang teachers unions knew it, and they didn't want to lose any of the funding. So they actively fought to trap those families at the worst time possible in their schools that weren't providing much of anything, and just to protect themselves at the expense of thousands of families. And it's absolutely horrendous. But at least these kinds of things happened, and people won't forget those kinds of things.
Yeah, absolutely. The same sort of thing happened here in Washington State. The state superintendent of public instruction tried to prevent the money from going to the virtual schools during the pandemic. It was outrageous. People were looking for options. Their school was closed down. They found we do have some small virtual schools that are successful, and the monopoly tried to prevent families from going there. I mean, just shows you how protective they are of their monopoly. It is outrageous.
That's why we say the only people against school choice are those that already have it.
Well,
Another question here. Amy asks, how is school choice defined for legislative purposes? If charter or private school, is it still under the rules of OSPI? How can it be truly independent?
Yeah, so the purest form of school choice is something called an education savings account. I believe this is what was introduced recently in Washington State. The number of states that have enacted new education savings account programs this year doubled from 5 states to 10 states. And the gold standard right now is everybody's looking at West Virginia. They didn't have any charter schools last year or any private school choice initiatives to have the funding follow the child. But in 2021, they said, you know what, we're going to make this happen. And it's regardless of your income, the state level portion of funding will follow the child to any approved education provider. And so that's already in action, already passed, signed into law in West Virginia. And it's the least likely type of school choice to be regulated because families can choose a multitude of different providers. It becomes extremely difficult for the regulator to figure out. And just historically, we've seen that these types of programs tend to be less regulated than things like charter schools, obviously, which are still highly regulated by the government. That's why they're still defined as quote unquote public schools, the charter schools. And the money goes to the families, and then they can choose these different types of providers. And we haven't seen a lot of strings attached to these types of programs. But I will say, even if there are some strings attached, it's better than the status quo where 90% of kids are stuck in these highly regulated, government-controlled government schools. So we should take a step in the right direction, especially if it's voluntary on the part of the families and it's voluntary on the part of the schools. No private school has to accept any voucher or any education savings account funding if they think that the regulations are too burdensome. And we see private schools making those choices, yes or no, in different states. And in states that have more regulations, we do see that that private schools are more likely to say no to the offer. So you'll still have a specialized segment of education providers that turn down the money, even if you do have a lot of regulations. But for most of the part, I've seen that these education savings account bills are not very regulated. And if you're a homeschool family that's particularly concerned about this, the way that they've done in a lot of the bills is that they can amend into the bill to make an ESA student, an education savings account student using the program, defined separately than a homeschool student in the law to provide separation so that there isn't confusion and so that the regulations don't spill over to the homeschool community. That's helped bring groups
That's
like
very
HSLDA
helpful.
on board. Yeah.
That's very helpful.
Mm-hmm. So I think, and by the way, look, the government's coming after the private educators anyway. The homeschool fam, they're already trying to regulate these segments of the population, and they're trying to regulate private schools even without the voucher funding or ESA funding. So we might as well get a broader coalition on our side, more people using education savings accounts and accessing private or homeschooling means you get a bigger tent pushing back against these regulations in the future. And by the way, it's all voluntary, and you can separate it out in the law to make sure to reduce the chances of regulations. And when more people are using private alternatives, it becomes more mainstream which decreases the likelihood that people in society will call to regulate homeschooling or private. Because before everybody kind of switched to homeschooling, I think homeschooling was seen more of kind of this odd thing that people didn't really know about, but everybody got some type of experience with it in 2020, 2021. And now I think people are, if you look at EdChoice's polling every single month since April of 2020, they've done repeat polls on this, and people are more favorable of homeschooling than ever before. And the odds ratio on that polling, they found that people were like 2 or 3 times as likely to say that they're now more favorable of homeschooling relative to before than to say that they were less favorable of homeschooling. So that should decrease the likelihood that regulations are even called for in the first place.
Yep, absolutely. And that is very helpful, Corey, because you're right. Washington State is pursuing educational savings accounts. So for our viewers, definitely stay on the lookout for that. Some positive news ahead. Let's hope. Probably one of our last questions here. Chris asks, Corey, can local districts or cities do anything that the state doesn't allow them to do, obviously as it pertains to education?
Yeah, so localities might be able to enact programs, but I will say, almost always seen this happen through the state legislature. Even when you pass like local programs, that typically go through the state legislature. But you could put things on the ballot. And for example, I think Leave talked about this a little earlier, that this might be something that is considered in Washington,
Yes.
But in California, right next door, they have 2 statewide ballot initiatives that are pending consideration for the 22 ballot in California. And the theory there behind the ballot initiative is that parents on the ground aren't captured by the interests of the teachers unions. Politicians in the state houses are more likely for that to be the case. So you might have a stronger chance of getting it done on the ballot in a deeply blue state than through the legislature. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try through the legislature, but you might be more likely to get parents on the ground who are Democrats to say yes than to get a Democrat in office to say yes, because of the different power dynamics of what happens once you get into office and who supports you. But you also have other problems, like in California with the ballot initiative. The language just came out from the Attorney General. The Attorney General is obviously has a political background that is not as supportive of school choice, and the language is just so biased against the measure. It's something like the compulsory funding of religious institutions or something. It's totally biased against it, and that's going to make it really much more difficult to pass it on the ballot, because the wording of the question is so important. We all know that. But it might be worth a shot if you can get the right, especially if you can get the right ballot language.
Have you seen any efforts like the effort in Douglas County, Colorado, to pass a voucher at the district level? Have you seen any nationwide?
There's not much of that going on right now. But that's something that's possible. There is actually something going through the New Hampshire legislature right now that what I think is really interesting is that most of these state level programs just tie the state portion of funding to the child. And New Hampshire just passed one of those called education freedom accounts, because they're so live free or die. They call them education freedom accounts. In New Hampshire, not education savings accounts, but they're the same thing. The state portion will follow the child to any private provider that is approved by the state. Now they're trying, and they just passed it to the House Education Committee, is that the local funding, if a locality has 60% of a vote to opt into this program, the local funding will be able to follow the child to a private provider. So that's another kind of way to think about this, is that you can pass through the legislature a local program that the localities all can choose whether to. I mean, there's an obvious problem there, right? That the localities may be more likely to be taken over by interest of the teachers unions. But if you can get leadership in those localities, you might be able to get it done that way too.
Amazing. Well, thank you both. Again, we want to thank Leave Finne and Corey DeAngelis. For more on our education reform work on WPC, please visit our website at washingtonpolicy.org. click the Center for Education using the Centers tab to focus in on specifically this topic. After a short 5-minute break, the Solutions Summit will continue here with our Small Business Center and lawsuits that matter.